And we are live, everybody. So welcome to this amazing webinar series. I think it's actually been maybe the most interesting thing I've been doing for the last several months. Principally because I'm entering a space where my knowledge is actually really weak. And it's been really educational to have conversations with people that really do know about compensation. So this is the third in our 3-part series. If you want to check out the earlier series, you can do so. They're pre-recorded, they're already recorded, should I say, and they're available for replay. So we'll be able to send you a link to those in sort of after the show. This one also will be recorded, and we've got one more to go after this before we conclude this series. But today, folks, we're going to be talking about, as Alistair mentioned, the necessary evil when it comes to doing anything with regards to compensation. And that is how you actually level your organization. What is leveling? When is the right time to do it? What are the challenges in doing it? How do you make sure it's actually implemented and accepted within the community? Those are the things we're going to be talking about today. Anyway, before we kick off and introduce our guests, I just want to make sure that everything is okay sound and audio wise. So if you can hear me okay, everybody, can you just let me know in the chat down there? I think at the bottom of your screen, you should see something on chat. Let me know whether you can hear me and see me okay. I did dress up for you folks. So, you know, if you can't actually see the video, what's the point? What's the point in all this work? And you should also know some features at the bottom as well. There's a poll. I think we're going to run a poll at some point. And also there's a questions feature also. So if you have any questions that you want to ask the guests, make sure you ask them in the ask questions section. We'll get to them at the end of the show. In the meantime, we'll also interact with you on the chat as well, because that's a fun thing for us to do. Okay, let's get on with our conversation. Let's say hello to our guests. Would you want to introduce yourself? Let's start with the co-pilot, Virgile. Virgile, quickly introduce yourself. Who are you? What it is you do?
So I'm Virgile. I'm a co-founder and CEO of Figure. So we are co-hosting the webinar with you, Hang, or at least the dressed up version of Hang today. And what we do as Figure, we're a compensation benchmarking platform for companies to check whether or not they're paying the accurate and fair market salaries. So of course, huge link to what we're doing today, because as you said, direct link between the way you work on leveling internally and the way you benchmark your salaries with the market data. So very happy to be here.
Yeah, fantastic, Virgile, and thanks for putting this series on. Really, really useful. Let's go to. I was going to go to Alistair, but he's left to go to the toilet. Let's go to Pavneet. Pavneet, can you introduce yourself? Who are you? What it is you do?
Hello, I'm Pavneet Khurana. I am an organizational psychologist and I work with Unleashed. Unleashed are a group of wonderful people and culture experts, and we support startups and scale-ups and all things people, culture, leadership development, organizational development. And I lead all of the inclusion work for Unleashed. So I'll be taking that particular lens for this discussion today.
Fantastic. And Alistair, introduce yourself. Who are you? What it is you do, sir?
Yeah, I'm Alistair. I'm the founder of Justly. We're a small consultancy, and we concentrate on helping startups or any company, to be quite honest, two things: figure out how to bring rigor to their career progression and growth within their company, and then tie that back objectively to pay, looking at primarily base salary, but also looking at commission, equity, and total reward as well. And just for context, I was letting the dog out of the room, not nipping to the bathroom then. So
I'm ready for all kinds of action, man.
This is why it could get lively here.
Yeah, this is why I refuse to do pre-recorded and I only do live streams, because I want to see some sort of incident occur. At some point, there'll be some incident that'll just cause everyone's jaws to drop. That's what I'm waiting for. Okay, let's start with this right from the top of the bat. What is leveling? Why is it important? Because I think most people have an inkling, but it's also one of those, it's kind of a jargonistic term that's been introduced maybe quite recently. And I wonder whether a lot of people might kind of now be using it fairly casually without truly understanding what it is and what its purpose. Any thoughts on that? Let's throw it open to the entire panel here. What is leveling? When do we need to do it?
I'll point towards our compensation pro, Al.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. I think essentially levels denote someone's seniority within a business, essentially how much scope they have within their role independently or as a team, if they're managing people and departments. but the leveling criteria you use to denote that seniority and scope and influence and responsibility varies widely. That's how I would describe levels.
And it's kind of like a standardization of it, isn't it? Because sometimes if you've got like a big organization and you allow your hiring manager to, or your line manager, shall we say, to kind of create new job titles and stuff, this is where you get the senior, junior, and it's like, it's not clear what the meaning is there. I mean, I think recruiters are very familiar with this actually, because if you've worked in a TA team or you were agency side, wasn't there times, folks, where you became a senior recruiter and you were wondering, how was that different from what I was doing before? And then you became like a team leader and you were still like on the sales calls and still trying to hit a target. So what's all that about? So it is about standardization and being very clear with what the job function is. And I guess that's taking away a little bit from the line. Is that right, guys? It's trying to centralize a little bit of the decision making as to how you can actually call people internally within the business.
Yeah, a lot of it is about alleviating any potential confusion and I guess enhancing clarity on expectations within roles, which naturally will enhance people's engagement with their role and I guess ensure that they know what's expected of them.
Yeah, fantastic. Do you know sort of, so I think public sector have always had leveling, haven't they? From a compliance point of view, it's always been the case where there's a grade of some type. There's usually like a very long, your grade A 2.7 or something, and it gives you something else. Very, very complicated thing. Is leveling really inspired from public sector, or has it emerged from somewhere else? Does anyone know like the history of this?
I think even before the public sector, it goes back to the army. I think you go back to the Roman army and the way they started their leveling, which was ranks within the army. The topic then was less career projection and am I being compensated fairly, and what about remote pay between Athens and Rome was different topics back then. But I think the way you define structure and expectation and then level of scope comes back, I think, early on from what I remember from like most structure within organizations such as tribes and such as army afterwards. So then even the public sector, I don't think any startup person would love to the parallel between saying leveling comes from the public sector because it's so anti-startup, but in some form of way, there was one putting out there strong leveling settings, promotion framework, and compensation linked to leveling in the first place, right? So it's very anti-startup to say so, but they were some of the first organizations to do so for sure.
Very interesting. I think you're right. It's uncool to say. I mean, not probably culturally, nothing could be further from startup than public sector, but it's been there longer and it's obviously got a history there. What would you say is the general percentage of organizations that have some sort of leveling structure? Do you think, is it common, or is it still something on the margins that's trying to go mainstream? What are your thoughts on that?
I wouldn't know figures, but I think the question that you asked is such a good one with regards to the source. And I think it's probably a high percentage because we don't question the source of why we create these things or why we use these models and processes today. When we question the source of why it's in existence, we're then able to question whether or not it's fit for purpose today. So I would guess that a lot because we don't often question the source and question its viability for its use today.
I think it's still quite low. I reckon it's 10% less in terms of all employers. It's actually a very low number because you have to intentionally do it, and you don't do it as a startup, right? As a very, very young business, if you're just a bunch of people in a room hacking away, that's probably not there. And you might just end up in a position where you suddenly have issues, and it's almost like you bring it in order to solve emerging problems rather than, it being baked in from the beginning. Alistair, is that your experience of it? I mean, you worked in startups and you've been running your own businesses as well.
It becomes when it starts becoming a problem, that's when there's that sort of knee-jerk reaction to like, we do need to bring some rigor to our hierarchy. And as we said at the beginning, like people are very reluctant to bring in hierarchical structures, especially when they're a small organization wanting to act in an agile manner and not, to Pavneek's point, one of her points that she put into our doc, that not to put people into boxes, but you do need to bring that that structure in, and there's a ton of reasons why, and some of them people will definitely agree with, and others I think there's probably some area for debate on why levels are necessary. But I work with all sorts of businesses, and I'm seeing more organizations that are in the low sort of 10, 15, 20s wanting to put levels in because they've seen the pain, having perhaps created organizations, their second or third time founders, seen the pain of not having levels, or alternatively just, events like today and the literature that's out there that says without this backbone, not just hiring, but compensation, progression, team creation, personal development, performance management, all of those employee practices fall apart without some sort of structure.
That's very interesting. I wonder whether we could run a quick poll. So Nick, if you're on this, can you set up a quick poll just to say, have you leveled your company, or are you planning to, or something like that? It'd be good to know just what the distribution is as to how many of us are actually gone to this place at this point. There should be a poll at the bottom there. Nick's going to set that up. Go ahead and vote on this and let us know where you're at on it, because it'd be interesting for me to see this. I know it's ancient history these days, but the last time I was working for an employer was maybe 6-7 years ago, something like that. There was certainly no leveling going on in any of my career before then. It wasn't considered. Pretty much head of department decided that the levels, who was senior, who was not, had the budget responsibility. There was no concept of saying, we need to actually have a centralized structure here. Al, you mentioned the pain of not doing this early. Can you describe for us, like, what are the reasons why you should do this early? Like, what are the pain points of not having a level business here?
I mean, I think you mentioned it right at the beginning, Hung, like having consistent level description on what a IC1 looks like, or an IC2 or an IC3. Otherwise, you'll have different departments with different interpretations and expectations of what that level looks like. And then it becomes quite painful when you have, a director of marketing and a director of engineering with completely different expectations, and then them being managed, their performance, their pay, etc., all being quite disjointed because of the interpretation of what a director looks like in marketing versus a director in engineering. So bringing consistency across the departments for those level descriptions that's where the pain, if you don't have that, that's where that inconsistency can be very painful.
Wouldn't it be the case, though, that certain departments are differently valued? I mean, it could just be in terms of how important that business is. So, for instance, in startup, very classically, we like to think product and engineering are the most important function because you're building this thing, and actually marketing or recruiting even, or whatever function it might be, that's actually less important. Therefore, would it make sense to have different, you might want to call the head of the department the same thing, but actually in terms of importance to the business is different. So should we have variance there, or are you saying that ultimately?
No, I wouldn't have variance on the description for the level. The variance on pay or value comes with the market position on your percentile that you're paying in, and also the job family that you map that role to will have an implication on that ultimate number. So you could have a director of marketing and a director of engineering with the same scope and influence and reach within your organization and expectations, but I don't know, we're going to pay the director of engineering less because marketing is much more strategically important for your business goals. So you don't dial the level down, you dial the percentile or the market position down.
Okay, I need to.
Do you agree with that, Virgil? You're nodding there. Hopefully you do.
No, fully agree. I think in terms of expectation, you should expect the same thing from like a head of or a senior type of person within your organization, but you might pay them differently depending on market data or depending on the impact for the business. But in terms of expectation, I think it's important that you expect the same thing from a head of marketing than a head of engineering in terms of scope of influence, potential impact, leadership ability, and so on.
Interesting. Pavneet, go to you on this, because we're talking about the problems of not doing it. So I'm assuming that again, from my position of ignorance, the problem of not doing it would be you might be then changing people's compensation or changing people's status in company, having recruited them in one context, and now you've leveled them, and actually some people are gonna be, there's gonna be winners and losers in that type of shakeout, isn't there? Now, from an organizational health point of view, organizational psychology point of view, can you describe for us, like, what are the things that might happen in a scenario if you haven't leveled your business in time?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, because if you level too fast, you stifle your culture, you bring rigidity, you bring hierarchy, you bring a lot of limitations to the way that you're able to see fluidity in the way that you work, and shared responsibilities, etc. But Virgil said it really interestingly there, that often when we think about conceptually levels, we think about scope of impact and sort of expectations in terms of output. But often when we're looking at compensation, we're looking at skills and strengths and experience. So it's interesting that it's important to understand that those things match up well, so that you've got a holistic view of value, to Al's point. And so I guess getting it into the business soon, as Al said, is really important to ensure that you have, I guess, enough flavor and enough color to the way in which people define their roles and the way that they can set expectations. But I guess the limitations come with rigidity and hierarchy. So having a cultural lens on the way that you look at levels is really important. So I really like the way that you described impact there, Virgil, because that's exactly the way that we would approach it. It's not around competency-based leveling or skills-based leveling. It's around strength and impact, so that you're able to bring in the nuances of your business and not see your organization as like for like to another. So yeah, a bit of a complex answer to your question, Hung, but
no, I don't think it's going to be tough for us to come out with like straight statements here, because it's so context driven. And I hope the audience will be patient with us if we're not able to, give you black and white answers. Having said that, let's try one. Like, when is the right time to level your business? Give us a number of headcount. Do you have a thought on this? And folks, if you have a thought on it, please put it in the chat. I want to get like a general vibe as to what the number is. Is it 5 people, 10 people, 50 people? You tell me. Go ahead, Al.
I mean, I'd actually say it's not determined on the current number of people in your organization. That's a factor, but I'd actually also say it's anticipating how many people you're going to hire into the business. So if you're 10 people, but you're going to do one of the super scale up, I'm going to hire 100 people in the next 12 months, you need to get levels in ASAP. If you're 10 people and you're hiring 2 or 3 people in the next 12 months, I think you could probably you could kick levels down the road a bit, put in some basic leveling structure. You might not need levels 1 to 8. You could perhaps put in 4, 5, depending on your org structure. So I think it depends on your current state, yes, but more importantly, future states. That would be my opinion.
Yeah, very good. How about you, Pavneet?
Oh, I'm not going to give you a number, but because it depends. It all depends on the type of roles that you have within the organization and the type of business that it is. I think that a good way to approach it, as Al said, to think about it in a scalable way. So if we start off small, if we have 50 people within an organization and we look at 3 levels, we're not looking at sort of rigid numbers. We're looking at scope of impact. So for example, who in the business is tactical, who in the business is strategic, who in the business is sort of leading and directing, and that way you're able to stretch it as you're moving forward. So you can actually implement that kind of thinking early on with a business of 10 people, but it allows you to have sort of that stretchability as you move through the numbers.
We're going to talk about elasticity throughout this conversation, I hope, because we're talking about levels, and it does get that entire metaphor feels very rigid, doesn't it? But there is plasticity there, isn't there? I love the comments, by the way. I love the comments in the chat. I think I've upset Leonam. I do beg your pardon. But I do like what people are saying. People are saying, look, it's not about the number. It's about if you're funding, it's about Series A rounds. So if you raise a significant figure, maybe that's kind of aligned a little bit with what Al's talking about in terms of the growth projection. So potentially you want to implement it pre then. You've got I think Hannah. Oh, hello, Hannah. Good to hear from you. She's saying 50. I was going to say 50. Seems about right to me. A rule of thumb. Or maybe you can do it in a non-numerical way. You can say, look, by the time you get managers, and you're looking at maybe managers of managers, like there's more than like 2 tiers, that's probably where you want to throw something in there. I don't know. Virgile, let's leave the final word to you. Can you give us a number of headcount, or are you reluctant to say?
You know what? I'll go on the other direction, and I think it won't hurt if you can use a simple enough framework from your first hires onward, like non-founder hires onward. Because we've talked about this in our series, right? The whole point is if you want fairness, and I'm coming from a compensation angle, right? If you want fairness in compensation, you need to take as objective decisions as possible from the get-go. So you need to remove as much room from negotiation and you need to use objective facts. And I think using a very simple model early on to say, do I pick this person to be more of a senior within my organization or an intermediate type of level? Well, for me, roughly, and for our model, senior is the ability to mentor newcomer, the ability to be autonomous on most tasks, apart from strategic one and so on. To have that line of thinking when you're about to make an offer, makes you a bit more objective. And I think the more objective you are, once again, we've talked about for a while, the more fair decision you can take. And fairness, if you don't take fair decision to start a business, and I think if you wait for Series A, and we've talked about this in our webinar on transparency, if you're not fair from the get-go, you're going to create issues, you're going to create skeletons in the closet that's going to blow up at some point. So I'd rather you use it in a very simple way, lightweight to begin with. Just let's say you have a simple framework that can work very early on to have some hiring decision as objective as possible, and they readjust it along the way. So I think from the first hire onward.
I was going to say just quickly, I think there's probably, to take a step back to Virgile's point about defining what is a simple framework. I think one thing we haven't unpacked here is when we talk about levels, in my experience, there is leveling criteria for salary benchmarking, which can be very lightweight and just focused around scope and influence, and could perhaps involve literally 3 or 4 descriptors, let's call them, versus a career progression framework, which is, impact, skills, competency based, which is a lot more detailed, which again does the same as leveling. But if you want to just do pure benchmarking and use a product like Figures, you'll have a very, and looking at the Figures leveling criteria, it's a very basic, but for the purpose of salary benchmarking, it works perfectly, versus when is the right time to introduce a progression and career progression. Right? That's a whole different leveling piece of work. And I'm very clear when I work with my clients, there's 2 distinctions there. There's leveling for salary benchmarking, and then there's leveling for career development and progression. So for salary benchmarking, I agree, Virgile, like day one, you could say, like, just to make sure you've got consistent hiring structure. For growth and career development, yes, you could probably kick it down the road a bit further.
It's very interesting how there's different philosophies as to what is driving that decision. So Virgile is saying founder plus one. I love that idea, because founders you can accept maybe are different from employees. Obviously, they have a different stake, different responsibility. So when you're hiring people from outside for the first time, that's when you need to have some sort of way of doing it. Otherwise, it can quickly get out of control. You have other people in the chat that are saying, look, there is a number, it's 50, it's 100, 300 people, whatever that number might be for different folks. You have a potential hierarchical view. So you think about how many tiers are starting to evolve in your business. Like when everyone's in a room, hey, it's literally a flat business. There's no level, there's single level. But then you get to a point where there's managers and other managers happening. Okay, great, maybe that's the moment. Go on, Virgile, you about to say something?
Yeah, I want to say something on what you were mentioning as well. I think there's been a shift into the availability of good resources about leveling. When you think about the past, the existing leveling framework where public sector, where big consultancy firms like Mercer, Radford, and the like that had very, very complex salary benchmarking levels and so on, that as a small organization, you are like, okay, those ones won't work for me, right? I have the alternative of using a leveling framework that won't work for me, or creating my own, which is a lot of work that as a young company is probably not the right time to do it, right? Now and more than ever, there's more and more resources coming in, right? I saw Marie on the chat from Learner Blythe. She published and Learner Blythe outsourced a leveling system that works very early on. And I think we're about to republish our one as well. I think more and more with existing resources, companies can attack that problem earlier. than before. So I think that will change also the ability from company to move on to a leveling framework earlier than before.
I think that's a really important point because I can imagine certain leveling frameworks to be like hyper intimidating because there's so much complexity in there, obviously based on how complex that business has been. And you're thinking, if you're just like pre-series A or something, you're just scrambling around. You think this seems to be too big a project for me to do right now, because there is actually no one to do it. This maybe a recruiter or a chief people officer, one person, maybe a small team. Like, how can you go ahead and do that? And you're right about the skeletons. Sometimes you're storing up problems for down the road, Virgile, but sometimes maybe that's the trade-off you have to make, because those skeletons, you're gonna have to think, right, I'll just clear out that closet somewhere down the road, because right now we've got to get on with this. So yeah, it's very interesting to see how we go. How do we tackle it, folks? So let's say we have a number, we want to do it, whatever the reason that we've come to this position. Like, where do I start? So I've got like 30 people, again, whatever the number is. How do I start tackling this problem? Thoughts on this? Al, maybe you can lead us off on this question.
Unmute myself. Yeah, I think that the place to start is obviously trying to define how many levels you need as your organization. So looking at the number of levels and then going out to market. And this is on the fact that you've decided you need them, right? You've defined it as a business. We're going forward with this. That's all been decided. Number of levels and then the leveling criteria. And to Virgile's point is the tricky bit that I find is people struggle to decide what they're building. Are they building a leveling structure for salary benchmarking, to my point earlier, or were they building a leveling and progression growth framework? And they are two different things in respect of like the involvement and time to build. So number of levels and then what you're going to use to build that. Building from scratch just doesn't make sense. There's a lot of great, content out there, again, to Virgile's point, that has been created in the last 2-3 years, lots of different software platforms. But again, I think it's deciding, what are you building the levels for? Is this for a salary benchmarking and compensation exercise, or is this to show people how they can grow and obtain more responsibilities and advance their career? So I think it's very important right at the beginning to determine which of those two you're building for and why you're putting levels in place.
Won't those problems come into parallel though, Al? I'm not quite sure that's ever a fork in the road, because if you're doing it purely, let's say you're doing it as a comp thing, as a way to figure out your comp, that's great. But inevitably, by that time, you've already got a crew of people in the business that maybe they're 1, 2, 3 years in. Of course, they're looking to progress onwards. So yeah. I think most people will say, yeah, we want both. So how would you deal with that situation?
They do. And I won't go into sort of selling what I do too much, but like it's having the conversation of what are your objectives? Is it a salary benchmarking exercise that you need to get done in the next 6 to 8 weeks? You can do that in a leveling framework off the shelf using, descriptions like the ones in the figures or all of the other, the Mercer descriptions or the Radford ones. Alternatively, are you going to build a framework for growth and advancement that does need to be an inclusive process? And that's much longer and takes a lot longer investment. And that's how I would sort of frame it, is what are we building?
I understand. So basically, one is
one's doable. One's a lot slower and needs more involvement and much more inclusive. And there won't be any, contention in the scoping and influence criteria, because it's a standardized passport that you can use from figures to Mercer to, different platforms for benchmarking.
Yeah, so I would imagine that's a step-by-step. Most people are going to say, sure, we're going to take the small and easy doable, and then we'll figure out the career progression as we go through. Okay, very interesting. Let's talk about the sort of levels, like the number of levels. How do we determine what is the appropriate number of levels in the business? Again, is this a numerical thing or what? Any thoughts? Virgile, maybe you want to come in and say something on that.
Yes, because I think that we have a good point of view on this one at Figures, because we now have 820 or so customers. And what we've seen is that our initial leveling framework, that had 4 individual contributors level and 5 5 manager levels was perfect for early stage startup. But after a certain while, it proved to be too simple for larger scale organization, right? And we discussed this with Al quite a few times as well. So you can't have a model that works for organization of all sizes. I don't think so. This is why we're reviewing our model. And in fact, we're creating 2 models. A simple one that we think works until maybe 150 to 200 employees, maybe a bit more, 250, right? It depends on the geography and maturity of the company, because what we've seen is that in the UK, for example, company seems to be much more mature, much more young. So it's not true for our geography. And then we have a more advanced leveling framework that will work for our companies that we think from 200, 250 onward, that will have 6 individual contributor level and 6 managers level, right? So, because I don't think there's one model to rule them all. I think if you use, it could be too simple or too complex depending on how many levels you want to have.
Yeah. Very, very good. What are those levels? Can you give us an example? So I'm just thinking there might be some people that are approaching this really from like ground zero. I'm just thinking, your individual contributor, or you're a manager, like, is there not just two? Is everything else just kind of BS thrown on top? Let's get away from the adverbs. Let's purely go with the verbs. What is the difference between, like, why is there need for 6 levels or more? Any thoughts on this? Maybe Pavneet, you got a view on this?
Yeah, I have a view on all of it, and it being really interconnected with one another. So I guess this work can never be done in isolation. And an answer to that question, I think you have to look to what your organizational goals are, what the future, or what the trajectory of your organization is, what your org structure could look like in the short term, in the long term, to determine what your levels are today. Excuse me. And then what your levels are in the future, so that you're able to provide that scalability. And therefore, you'll then have the answers from that. I think that it's important to make sure that there is no, there is no sort of one way to define number of levels. It really just does depend on what your organization's growth trajectory looks like, and therefore the layers and the levels of experience and the knowledge and the impact that you want to have within those different buckets of your organization. So in answer to your previous question around when do you start, you have to, I would continue to argue that there is never going to be a number, because if you're not looking closely at your organization's future, then if you're looking at arbitrary numbers to say, oh, when we reach 60 people, that's when I've got to do this, then you're going to set yourself up for failure. So you need to look closely at your growth trajectory, because every organization grows at a different pace. So that will all determine, when you're looking at sort of the goals, the org structure, the future look and feel of your organization, that's the logic step that we would recommend that you go through in order to understand what the number of levels you need today versus what you need in 6 months' time. Okay, a little bit tangential sort of question, but it's just occurred to me. A lot of the work, the way in which we're having this conversation seems to be, there is a no leveling situation, and then there's a leveling situation. So it feels like it's like a big waterfall project. Lots of requirements capture, a lot of consensus driven, all this type of stuff, and then boom, we roll it out. That's all well and good, but is there a more iterative way of doing it, to say, hey, we're going to just roughly do some leveling right now, and then we're going to review it in 3 months' time, and then we're going to refine it going forward, ease just 3 month sprints, even 1 month sprints or whatever. Is that a legitimate way of doing it, or do you think it's like too destructive culturally or politically internally within the business to have what is in effect changing a scenario? Thoughts on this? Al said earlier around understanding why you want to do this work in the first place, and I think part of that why is understanding the employee experience. What do you want people to think? What do you want people to feel? What do you want them to do as a result of this work? And once you understand that clearly, you'll be able to take the right actions to determine whether or not you do something iteratively and test and change, or you take that considerable effort to sort of involve employees in that design process. So I think the why is a really ultimate important bit, and not only for the business objective, but for the individual experience too. I agree. I think the why, and just to come back to my point of the two distinctions, if the why is for compensation and salary benchmarking, there's an argument that you're leveling roles, not people, right? And that's a very
big distinction when it comes to, you've introduced your levels, you come to an agreement on the number of levels you need, you've selected a leveling criteria for, for the purpose of leveling. When it then comes to slotting people into that and leveling, it's, are we leveling roles or people? So I'm looking at it through a comp lens right at this moment, not a career progression advancement lens. And you can do that quite quickly. We're leveling the organization, we're introducing this, and the objective is to level roles, not people. And this is not performance-based, this is role-based. And this is the expectations for that role, regardless of whether it's Hung, Alistair, Pavneet or Virgile doing it. You are senior engineers, which we have defined as an IC4 using this leveling framework. That is, you can move quite quickly because you should not, we're not leveling people. We're not leveling people based on performance, etc. We're leveling roles.
And that's also a way to get the acceptance, isn't it? To say, look, when the existing member, you could say, look, this is going to be true for new hires that we bring in. They're going to be very clearly slotted into these levels, but the existing incumbent staff, you've got some ramp or runway to self-sort into these levels as you see fit, and we'll kind of leave you a little bit outside of structure for the time being. I have like skeptical view of faces on screen. Like, I'm just guessing. Is that the way some people do it, or is that totally wrong? I mean,
from Virgile.
No, but I was skeptical of something else. I have a very strong view that what you mentioned about like introducing leveling very early on, a lightweight for compensation. About career progression, I'll tell you something I think that may be a bit controversial. I think too many companies are putting in place career frameworks too early, because it's what most people ask, right? And I think that's very weird thing that like the world has changed in a way that most people want a lot of autonomy, a lot of responsibility and accountability and autonomy within their role. So I'm like, I want to drive my own role. I want my manager to provide feedback, but I'm the owner of my scope. I want to be the owner of my scope, responsible. But still have this, what I think is an old school way of being like, I expect my company to tell me what I can achieve in the next 5 years through a very detailed career progression, which I think, and this, to be honest, as a personal point of view, and I've never managed to crack it into how we can make it work, but it's something that bugs me quite a lot. Because I think that if people want ownership and accountability and responsibility, we should find a way in the career progression to move away from a very rigid, this is what you can do in 1 year, in 2 years, in 5 years, in 10 years. Because in a way, we have this weird thing when people want to feel very autonomous and responsible and be like, I want my company to apply to what I'll be doing in 1 year or 2. I'd love to find an alternative to career framework by pushing more accountability. People says, what can we do to help you decide what you want to do, to have more focus on what are your strengths, what you need to work on, because we don't want to define a precise career framework. And even it can be counterproductive for an early stage company to do so because the organization is moving all the time. So I'm a bit anti career leveling framework, and I love to see alternative ways, to more empowering way for people to define their own path without organization moving downward. So for compensation, all for it, because it's objective, fairness is important. Career progression, I'm still not super aligned with this as a standard way to go.
I think just to come into there, Virgile, I think you're absolutely right. There's certain people, like we're down to personality traits here, that would resist the concept of moving up levels. I'm thinking actually right now of a very good friend of mine who is exactly this way. He will only ever be a free radical. Hello, Tank, by the way, if you're there. We need to catch up. But he's exactly that way. There's no way, and he would resist any sense of constraint because, like, as you say, he wants to decide his own scope. That's very, very important for him. But therefore, he has always existed in a like contentious situation with a business. There is an argument. You can say, okay, this person is either a natural freelancer or is a person that maybe is an entrepreneur or someone who perhaps it's going to be difficult for them to fit into a structured business in this way. It's always going to be a little bit looser. But yeah, I think there's a tension between a certain culture of a company, and Pavneet, maybe you can come in here where, Unleash are interacting with so many businesses out there. I'm sure you've identified very different cultural traits between different types of organization. And maybe, it's a case where personalities need to self-sort into the right organization rather than constantly battle away with a company culture that isn't right for them. Your thoughts on that very quickly?
Yeah, there's we did some research a few years back actually on employee motivation and sort of common pillars of the employee experience and how that guides the way that we design the employee experience. And the things that came out of that were purpose, autonomy, and growth, beyond sort of the hygiene factors of pay and stability and contracts and things like that. But purpose, autonomy, and challenge being things that we must consider in all aspects of employee experience design, because of the data that we were looking at and the people that we were speaking to, and what we found to be enhancing employee engagement. So we always come back to those things when looking even at things like salary leveling or career framework leveling, and how we can ensure that individuals have got those three elements, or those three elements are incorporated in the design of that work. So I guess it's less around self-sorting personality types, but it's ensuring that we're listening to the employees of the organization to ensure that we're designing something that's right for them. So the way in which we might design this in one organization will be completely different to another, just because of the nuances of the culture. So I guess there's two parts of that. One is the common pillars that we experience and are necessary for our design, and the second is making sure that we're listening to the people who are in the room at that moment, and are connected to the culture in a much deeper way than we can ever be. So those are the factors that we would consider. Yeah,
very interesting. I think also it's got a great deal to do with the role as well. We don't have time to dive into it particularly, but where there's certain, if you like, mature functions, then probably a more structured leveling approach is more appropriate, because it's very clear what the value is, what the performance needs to be, what the behavior needs to be to get to those places. But let's say there's an entirely new function that's arrived into the business. It may not be that obvious right away. Good example actually is in TA. We may, for instance, we're starting to see talent intelligence now moving into talent acquisition as a function, as a new function. I would argue that it's probably harder for us to level a sort of a talent intelligence subgroup than it would be for, let's say, a sourcing function, because we know what sourcing is. We've been doing it for 15 years, whereas TI has been in for the last two years or so. So it has something to do with the maturation of the function as well. And obviously we know jobs change. So, a degree of sensitivity that way is necessary as well. Folks, there's loads of questions and we'll get to them soon, but let's just cover off a few major issues that we might encounter when we go through the leveling process. Can we talk about these? In your experience, Al, what's the most common problem you've encountered from your customers when they try to go to basically try to put a leveling framework in?
I think that the biggest challenge, that the sort of roadblock, once you've defined your organizational structure, as in numbers of levels required, you've settled on a leveling framework, you've settled on tracks for progression, whether you're an individual contributor or a professional or a manager, that structure's nailed down. I think that the roadblocks that would typically hit is then communicating, to Bhavneet's point earlier on, the why of we're doing this to the wider population, making sure that we have those people on the margins, or the free radicals that you mentioned, Hung. Like, if you don't land it well with them, the whole lot comes and falls apart. Putting people into those boxes is tough, and that comes back to, are we leveling roles or are we leveling people? And that getting that communicated across clearly, and the objectives and the why we're doing this is probably the hardest bit, that change management piece. And then making sure that when you are running that leveling process, whatever process you run involving managers, do you get people to level themselves to make it an inclusive process? Do you run group calibrations? That obviously adds on more time, but it helps to mitigate for bias. But then there's a conflict that people want to move, especially in salary benchmarking, very, very quickly. So there's lots of being pulled in sort of different directions. So there's lots of problems, and it depends on speed, and I think the communication of the objectives of the project that it usually boils down to.
Yeah, and let's not forget, folks, the people who are typically doing this have operational duties as we go. They're not sitting on the bench. TA people, CPOs, they're doing work, and then this new thing happens. I guess this is where you found a happy scene for your business, Alistair, because there's a requirement for it. And I guess same with you, Pavneet. You know, there's an external source I think can also provide, if you're like a third party view, because sometimes if you're the person doing it and you're also sort of a participant observer, so to speak, then you know there is potential questions about how neutral you are, for instance. So okay, Pavneet, let's go to you. What sort of problems are you seeing that companies kind of encounter? Common things that you think actually you need to bear this in mind when you go level your business.
Can I give you two? One is geographical leveling. How do we ensure that we're leveling geographically in a fair way? And Virgil, I'd love to get your perspective on that one. And the second one, I think, which is really common, I would say, in many organizations that we work with, is manager capability to handle the communication and the delivery of this work, and not only bring this in a factual, structural way, but respond to individuality. So often when a new leveling structure is introduced, it throws up a lot of kind of nuances in the way that people think and feel. So, for example, people feeling that there's an imposter syndrome within the way in which they're leveled. Like, oh, I'm the same level as that person. That can't be right. I'm nowhere near as good as that person. Or how does that link with my career progression? Or what does this mean for me in 6 months' time? Like really building that bigger picture. That's one of the biggest challenges that we support businesses with, is the manager capability to what happens after this has been rolled out.
And again, this is why I know I'm a negative person, Pavneet, because I'm immediately thinking about the negative and sort of the opposite of what you said there. Like you might be outraged that someone is on the same level as you. You're thinking, who the hell is this guy? You know, this guy's an incompetent, and here he is at the same level as me. Absolutely outrageous. How do you handle that scenario? I mean, have you encountered customers that come to you and say, "Listen, we've leveled it and it's kicking off on Slack"? You know, like, how have you coached businesses to get over that?
Yeah, that's why communication of this is a really important part, and I guess that plays a really important part in the design process too. So if you haven't incorporated employees in the design process in the first place, you're going to enter those challenges later. And so how we would support businesses to solve for that would be to have the levels of group communication and individualized communication, so that we're actually responding to individual needs while delivering the information. So if we know the particular circumstance of an individual, or if we know the growth trajectory or the growth motivations of an individual, then we're able to deliver the information as a manager in the right way for them specifically. And it's important that one-to-one conversations happen either right before or immediately after group-wide communication, so that there's a level of care and nurture that sits with this work. And I guess that happens with any kind of change process, really. But yeah, I guess considering individuality and employee nurturing through the whole process.
Yeah, and also I guess, you know, when do you make the announcement if you're going to move people into levels? Like, is that a big bang sort of box? Do you just like publish it on a board like a university exam, or you know how do you have that conversation? Or is it you need to do like bilateral conversations first? Is that the policy? Would you say?
Yeah, once again, I'm going to say it depends, but it depends on your culture and what the norms you've been able to establish and how you've worked in the past. But a combination of both. Done in a really sensitive way. And obviously one of something that comes up is how transparent can we be, and do we publish this company wide? All of those nuances that come up, really.
Yeah, interesting. I would do it in the same way that Better.com CEO did, just a mass Zoom call with everybody. Like just
read out the levels one at a time.
That's it. You're here. Just see the fireworks emerge. Virgil, very quickly to you, because we've only got 10 minutes and we'll get to questions. But what is the most common problem that you've encountered when companies have used your services or use your compensation tech to do some leveling, and you've heard something, or they've come to you and said, "Listen, this is a go."
Something we discussed not doing it early enough, and I think there was a question from Marie in the chat. How do you introduce leveling to employee when company never had leveling in 10 years? I've heard this story. I'm in a Slack with a lot of tech folks from the US, and some people were talking about how Netflix, we traditionally had no ranges when it comes to salary to compensation, or like give us the best offer you can get to the market would match it. It's now introducing leveling and salary band, and it's kind of a shit fest into people that expected to be principals are rated as senior engineers, and a lot of them are getting pissed off, and getting pissed off despite being some of the highest paid engineers on earth, because leveling, getting assigned a level you don't like is an issue. So once again, I think it's simpler to start with a simple model that's not perfect, that you can potentially work on, and to have like an 800-person organization, 2,000 employees organization, being like, okay, you're gonna introduce again, you're gonna piss a lot of people off. So I think once again, I get back to do it earlier better than later.
Earlier the better. And of course, these days there's public data available, so not only is your leveling sort of relevant to you, but if it doesn't match what's happening on the open market in some way, if it doesn't map to it, then obviously people are going to have issues. So even there's a very famous product, levels.fyi, right, where it's literally people who have just volunteered what the leveling is on big tech companies. So you can actually compare, oh yeah, level 3 here is a level 4 there, and then, you know, do it that way. So, okay, listen, we are running out of time, so we need to go to the questions because people have been piling in to the questions here. So I'm going to sort by votes because you can vote on the questions, folks. So if too late to ask a question, but you can vote on the questions. We've got Hannah again, our friend Hannah. She's got the highest votes. Let's start a question there. Okay, what levels? We have levels which do not necessarily correlate with titles. How do you see titles versus levels? So I personally don't quite understand what she means by this, but can you? I'm sure you guys do. So job titles and levels may not map correctly. What do you do in that situation?
If I jump on it quickly, that to us, whatever you have a leveling framework, that is a source of truth, right? Whatever you put on LinkedIn post, you want to be whatever on your LinkedIn post when it comes to compensation, when it comes to career progression, when it comes to expectation evaluation, is whatever you have on your leveling frameworks that matter. And you can have a policy that you can have some fun. So the point is like, can I be a head of whatever externally, but internally I'm just like a team lead? I think it's not a big issue as long as the expectations are clear that what's the source of truth when it comes to compensation, performance evaluation, and so on is what you have defined internally.
Yeah, so very quick summary, Hannah. What we need to do is have that internal consistency, talk about it. This is what it means when we say titles. Forget about what's going on externally on that, I think. Okay, let's move on. Hannah again with another question. I'll give you another one. Okay, how do you level new joiners and assign a salary based on that level during the recruiting process when you haven't fully seen their work yet? Very interesting. So have we lost control over our own salary, sort of how we compensate people, because we have to force them to a level and it's that number? How do we deal with that? Alistair, let's go to you. We can't go to everyone. A quick answer.
Gosh, it's tough. It's not easy because you're going to have limited data, right, from that recruitment process. It could be a matter of hours. So you're making what is probably quite a subjective opinion based on your opinion. And I think the key is to have leveling criteria in place and then to test through the process, that hiring process, does that person match this criteria? That means a level 3 in our org or level 4. You'll probably likely be spanning, we don't know if they're a 4 or a 3, but you have to make a decision at one point. But it is tough. And I think there are elements where we've all overhired. We've brought someone in who's, let's say, a 4 on a high salary, and then they're not meeting expectations. That's the whole point of the probation process as well, if you have one.
Yeah. In this, and I'll shut up as well after Hank, but on this, I've worked in the company when Criteo, a few of them here, and I know other companies who have the same policy that we said during the probationary period, we could adjust your level and potential salary if you made a mistake. And it was potentially on the way up, right? But we also had cases where we said, you know what, we've leveled you at level 4. We think we made a mistake based on your work. If you want to stay, be at a level 3. And with a potential salary change, if not, we'll be terminating the probationary period.
Yeah, I was going to say it's better to lose someone in the hiring process than to over level them and bring them in and then have that pain of having to de-level them or let them go because they're not meeting expectations. But yeah, it's tough.
That's true, but I really like the way Virgil delivered his de-leveling chat. I think I would accept it from you, Virgil. That's very, very well delivered. Okay, let's go to Marie. Marie saying, okay, quick one. How do you introduce leveling to employees when your company has never had leveling since the company's been created? I think we've answered that a little bit, so we're going to have to move on. Sorry, Marie. Let's go to Hakon. Hakon is saying, at what stage in a startup's growth do the panel think introducing level becomes critical, earlier than better, or is this counterintuitive? I think we've also answered it, but it's an important one. When is it absolutely necessary? So beyond the point where, you know what, the company's going to collapse if you don't do this. Quick answer, everyone. Real quick. Go around.
When you're entering a phase of intense growth, that's when you're going to break.
Yep. Okay. Everyone happy with that?
I'd agree with that. Or if you've got exceptional problems with salary benchmarking and people leaving because of pay. Yep.
Cool. Excellent. Let's move on. We've got Melitza saying, how do leveling models and competency frameworks work together? What is the best way to introduce them internally? So I think what Melitza is saying is, okay, we have a leveling structure. How do we map in their capabilities to this, like measure performance? I guess this is something, Alistair, you've been very keen to talk about. How do they work together? I guess it's just a long project, but do you want to give this like a quick 60-second answer?
Yeah, leveling for comp is a lot quicker and easier to use standardized criteria. The career progression and competency piece is obviously going to be specific to a company, an inclusive process, and takes longer, but they are two parts of the same puzzle. You can build both at the same time, or you can start with leveling and just using very, very basic criteria. I think it comes down to, again, Pavneet's points. Why are you building this? What are you doing? What are your objectives? But you can build both at the same time. It's just that's a 3-month, 4-month project. Salary benchmarking you can do in a matter of days or weeks.
Yeah, and I think benchmarking is probably something that most people probably want to get started on. This is probably where we're going to end the conversation. Just to link it back to the earlier webinars we've done, things like salary transparency, pay equity, things of this type. What do you think is the impact on those issues with a company that has leveled their business? Let's go around on this. Pavneet, let's go to you first. So we're talking about fairer pay, better compensation, just better rewards, and hopefully, a better atmosphere about the business if everyone feels they've got a legit shot. How have you seen leveling be pro or negative on that score?
By using multiple data points, by looking at compensation as a whole, by looking at salary as well as benefits, as well as other sort of compensation elements, but also looking at any pay gaps that exist within your organization already, really unpicking that when you're looking at your benchmarking frameworks as well, and making sure that you're looking at your growth trajectory, as I mentioned earlier, the organizational goals and the org structure beyond. So making sure that there are multiple data points in how you're making the decision with the individual right in the center. That's the only way you're going to be able to make sure that your process is inclusive as possible, and also is right for your organization, not just something you've lifted from progression.fyi.
Yeah, very, very good. Okay, let's keep going around. Alistair, let's go to you. In terms of pay equity, just generally being fairer about your business, and I guess that then translates into your ability to hire and employer branding and all that type of stuff. What would you say is the impact of something like leveling?
I think you pretty much summed it up. It's bringing transparency to the way in which you can grow. Again, looking at through a lens of comp, transparency to the process around how pay is determined. Is it fair? Is it unbiased? Has it been an inclusive process? And making sure that you're treating all employees in an equitable and consistent manner. I think without those levels, it's very hard to actually achieve all of the things I just said prior to that.
And maybe that's actually a good thing to learn. I mean, it sounds like it's a huge project for a lot of people, I'm sure. But at the end of the day, leveling is a tool that everyone in the business is going to help you do a lot of things once you have it in there. It's going to help management for sure. It's going to help recruiting for sure. It's going to help retention for sure. It's going to do all of those things. So it's one of those where once you've brought it in, then it's going to make the difference. Virgile, final word to you. In terms of people that are thinking, right, all this is great. How can I get information to help? Have Figures got anything that can get people rolling and get people started on this?
Yeah, so I just shared on the Notion page early access to something we're probably going to finish end of this week or next week into introduction to our leveling framework. So there's a simple one for less mature companies and a more advanced one for later stage company. But regardless, and resources, we've talked about progression at FYI, Marie Chandler, frameworks. I mean, there's lots of resources to have a look. But I think the key point is now it's not an issue of resources anymore, it's an issue of willingness to get started. And once again, we discussed that last week or 2 weeks ago during our transparency webinar. It's like you can't manage people unfairly anymore. The more we progress, the more there's going to be transparency in pay, and unfairness and inequality in pay is going to blow up at your face as a company. Unfairness in the way you promote, evaluate people is going to blow up at your face as well. So I think people, company have to get serious about the compensation, serious about leveling as early as possible, the earlier possible, because if not, I think they're creating legacy issue that will go up at their face tomorrow. So it's time to get to work, I'd say.
Time to get to work. Action orientation, folks. And I would recommend you check out the Figures Leveling Notion page, version 2. It's actually really good. I've just checked it out now. Probably is going to make the Brain Food newsletter at some point, actually, if I haven't already put it in there, just to distribute it further. We've run out of time, unfortunately. So, folks, I hope you've enjoyed the show so far. I've got one more to go, one more webinar of this series to go. So make sure you're aware of that. Megan, if you could share the link to the next one into the chat, if it's up there. Go register on that, and we can rejoin the conversation at that point. In the meantime, let me just thank all of you for watching. It's been great having you on. Thank you for sharing so much information in the chat as well. Thank you, Alistair Fraser. Thank you, Pavneet Karuna. Thank you, Virgil Rangard. And good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for watching.
Thanks, everyone.